Shine On, Harvest Moon by Monique Bos. I attended high school with a girl whose mother had set her on fire. We knew the story well before Tia Jefferson made her first tentative appearance at Woodrow Wilson Senior High. Her grandparents lived in our town, and reporters thronged their lawn for months, from the day Elena Jefferson lit her 3 daughters and herself on fire, to the evening when a jury doomed her to pass the remainder of her life on death row. We knew that Tia's younger sisters had died in the tragedy, one in the hospital after several agonizing days, and that Tia herself had suffered 3rd and 2nd-degree burns over more than half her body, including her face. We knew Elena, Tia's mother, had escaped nearly unscathed. Either her suicide attempt had been a stunning failure, or she hadn't been serious about wanting to die. We were never fair to Tia. I can concede that now. There are no excuses, just explanations. We were teenagers, cruel in our inexperience and lack of empathy and invincible youth. We had no concept of what Tia had endured, no realization of the difficulty she must have faced, starting a new school where everyone knew the worst thing that had ever happened to her. And on top of that, half her face was scarred, twisted, wrinkled. There was talk of skin grafts, plastic surgery, but Elena Jefferson had carried no insurance for her children, and Tia's grandparents spent what little savings they had on the sisters' hospital care and the double funeral. Some of us called her Freddie, as in Krueger, because her skin resembled his. Some of us told her she should follow Jason Voorhees' example and invest in a hockey mask. Some of us said she should take a page from Michael Myers' book and cover her ugly face. From the beginning, we conflated Tia with the worst boogeymen we knew, the mass murderers of our favorite horror movies. We attributed her mother's unspeakable crime to her, rationalizing that because Tia survived when her sisters didn't, she must share some of the guilt. Living, especially in such a visibly damaged state, was an unforgivable sin to us. Tia started school 2 weeks into sophomore year, which made her even more of a target of our ostracism. She had no choice about missing those first classes. She'd been testifying at her mother's trial, and then there had been a dispute about whether she'd live with her mother's parents or with her father, whom she hadn't seen since she was 5. So when she finally showed up, we'd been expecting and talking and speculating about her. We all knew her recent history, and we poured the kind of intense scrutiny on her that drives teen Hollywood starlets to alcohol and drugs. I might as well be honest here. I was among the worst. You know that saying, a face only a mother could love? On her first day, I told Tia she had a face only a mother could kill. This was before school shootings became so commonplace, before Columbine, and I'd like to say we weren't aware of how much damage our bullying could do, but that would be a lie. Of course we knew. The damage was our main motivation. Seeing Tia turn away, never in tears, she never cried. I guess the tears had been burned out of her. And hunch into herself, watching her brown eyes go blank and flat, enjoying the feel of her humiliation and our triumph. These were our incentive and our reward. You hate me, I'm sure. Would it help if I tell you I loathe myself when I think back on the way we treated poor Tia? Or can you at least credit my honesty in owning up to my part of what happened? If Tia herself never emerges as a player in my story, it's because I never conceived of her as anything except the girl with the maimed face. We called her the Phantom of the Opera and mocked her refusal to hide behind a mask. No one I knew ever had a conversation with her. Perhaps some of the teachers did. Perhaps they tried to reach her. But even for them, I suspect she was an object of pity and horror and revulsion. Or maybe one of the rejects tried to befriend her, the black trenchcoat boys who played Dungeons and Dragons, or the druggies or the slutty girls. Maybe one of them approached her on the way home from school and asked her about herself, about who she really was beneath the face and beyond the news. But maybe not. I never saw anything like that. What I remember is Tia Jefferson alone, always, in the back corner of the cafeteria at lunch, not eating the damp sandwiches her grandmother packed for her, at her own table during study hall, drawing pentagrams in her notebook with a chewed-up ink pen, changing clothes in a toilet stall before and after gym class, rather than stripping down in front of us. I've become a bit obsessed with Tia Jefferson recently. There's a surprising dearth of material online, probably because we attended high school just before the dawn of the information age. I did find one poorly written paperback, pages falling out, about her mother's crime. The author, attuned to the zeitgeist of the time, blamed the murders on Satanism. Elena's drug habits and occasional prostitution received little more than footnotes, although I suspect they were far more likely contributors to her actions than some nebulous spiritual beliefs. I briefly considered trying to interview Tia's grandparents or other surviving relatives, but I gave that idea up. The grandparents had moved away from our town, and if I told them who I was, they'd probably chase me off with a shotgun. And why not? It was less than I deserved. So Tia, in my mind, remains an enigma, a blank slate, an absence behind a scarred exterior. Maybe she wasn't especially bright. Maybe she didn't have much spirit or personality. Maybe she'd been a surly, socially inept child before the tragedy in her life. We gave her no chance to be anything else afterward. Every fall, Woodrow students held a hayride and bonfire the week after homecoming. The event always took place on a Saturday afternoon melting into evening. And because it wasn't an official school event, we managed to bring flasks and evade chaperones. More than one baby was conceived in that hay wagon or beyond the sparks of the fire. Everyone knew about it, including parents and police. We held it every year at the Lawtons farm, and they'd been hosting it for 20 years, since the first of their 12 boys started high school. The second youngest was in my grade, and by the time the first generation had finished, the second generation would be about ready for high school. So we figured the tradition would continue forever. Invitations never went out because everyone just knew. But someone lit on the idea to make sure Tia Jefferson heard about it, and for weeks we taunted her. "You ought to come. There's going to be a huge bonfire, and we hear you love those." The day before homecoming, in true Carrie fashion, one of the popular boys, Jason, the one I happened to be dating, decided to ask Tia to be his date to the hayride. I spurred him on. When we approached her with his offer, she said nothing, just turned away. She wasn't naive. She knew he couldn't be serious. But he kept at her for the next week, while the rest of us made cracks within her hearing. "Bring a blindfold, because that's the only way you'll be able to stand kissing her. The sex will definitely be doggy style. Careful not to knock her up. The baby killing might be genetic." There was no defining moment in that particular torture campaign, no taunt that was worse than the others. Tia never gave in, never thought Jason's attentions were anything more than a cruel prank. He didn't try very hard to persuade her otherwise. But the Friday afternoon before the hayride, as I linked my arm in his and headed for the parking lot, I looked back at Tia and saw for the first time an expression on her face, a smoldering hatred, shocking in its intensity as well as its viciousness. I shuddered and nestled closer to Jason, pushing my breasts against his upper arm to distract him. I didn't tell him the reason for my sudden clinginess. I wasn't about to admit Tia Jefferson had gotten to me. We were all shocked the next day when she showed up to the hayride. Everyone knew it was only for the popular kids, only for winners. The geeks and nerds never bothered to put in an appearance. Despite their plentiful offspring, the Laughtons were among the wealthiest families around, with sons who tended to be tall and golden-haired, who were inevitably awarded late-model convertibles on their 16th birthdays, who lavished their girlfriends with jewelry and flowers, and who would assuredly remain in our small town for the rest of their lives, working on the family farm or in one of the businesses that had sprung up around Main Street. They were not a family who associated with or encouraged approaches by high school losers. But Tia clambered onto the hay wagon, which was hitched not to horses but to an old red tractor, with the same bland imperviousness she had shown for the 6 weeks of her attendance at Woodrow. She ignored the stares and whispers and outright taunts, turning her face outward to the view of pumpkin fields and dead corn stalks. She did nothing, said nothing, as the hayride started. Did nothing, said nothing, as we laughed and sang, as couples began to get frisky and the booze came out. Jason, leaning over to stick his tongue down my throat, spilled Jack Daniels onto his lap and cursed. Chuck Lawton, who had graduated from Woodrow the year before and was the closest thing to an adult around, was driving the tractor with an open can of beer in his hand. He cranked the tractor radio up loud, and we were having a riotously good time. Then someone screamed. Tia sat there, in the midst of hay and booze, holding a massive box of kitchen matches in one hand and a piece of straw, burning at one end, in the other. "What the fuck?" someone said, and someone else lunged toward Tia, but Tia held the burning stalk down toward the bale on which she sat. "Don't come any closer." I realized it was the first time in 6 weeks I had heard her voice. It was soft, jarringly sweet. "Chuck, stop the tractor!" someone yelled, but he had the music turned up too loud to hear. "I hate you," Tia Jefferson said, in a clear, almost kind tone. "I hate you all." And then she stood, leaned over, and dropped the burning straw on Jason's lap. It landed just to the right of his crotch, on the exact spot where he'd spilled the whiskey, and his pants blazed up. Chuck finally heard the screams, but by the time he'd stopped the tractor and turned around, Tia had lit more matches and scattered them through the straw and near the flasks. She aimed well. She must have spent the first part of the ride studying us, figuring out who was most drunk and where alcohol had spilled. She didn't waste matches on anyone sober enough to smack the fires out. People began piling off the wagon, jumping, rolling in the ditches beside the road. But more people were trapped, some even trampled, and in the middle of it all, Tia sat there beatifically, lighting match after match until the entire box caught fire and her hand blazed into flames. The fire caught terribly quickly and spread, consuming the desiccated straw bales on the wagon, and in the surrounding field, the dry yellow husks that once had been corn stalks. Later, the inspectors said the whole thing was premeditated, that Tia must have come out the previous night and poured gasoline around the exact spot where she planned to start the fire. And we were in a drought, so even the irrigation ditches that normally held a trickle of water were cracked and barren. Some of us got away, more didn't. Bones were broken when people leaped from the wagon. Kids landed on top of each other, cracking legs, arms, spines. And then the tractor exploded, so even those who thought they were safe, who were maybe still trying to help put out fires on other people, or who were frozen in shock or horror, burst into flame. I understand Tia now. I understand why she'd want to die. Why, after what she endured, the continuing ridicule was simply too much to survive. Why, whenever she looked in the mirror, loathing for everyone and everything consumed her. She despised what she saw. I live with the memory of her eyes on me, her calm voice saying, "I hate you all." And although I know it was true, she did hate us all. She hated me especially. Although it's been nearly a quarter century, I'm still shocked when I look in a mirror. I still expect to see my old face, the one I wore until I was 16, until I got crosswise of Tia Jefferson. The red, puckered scalp where hair no longer grows, except in patches. The eye permanently scarred into an uplift at the corner. The grotesque parody of a nose. The twisted lip. Sometimes I have considered these my penance, my fair payback for the heartless, cruel bitch I was as a teenager. Sometimes I see them as a curse visited on me by a girl who was herself cursed. Sometimes I see them as destiny. The Lawtons never held another hayride, of course. There were lawsuits and police investigations and talk of criminal charges. The parents sold the farm at a loss, and the sons scattered. Those of us with burns received generous settlements from our insurance companies, and some of us still live on disability checks. There's a memorial wall at Woodrow which closed in 2001, and a population of aging people with various scars, internal and external, floating like ghosts around town. I've heard that some of them have formed a sort of survivors group, that they meet, talk, reminisce. I never speak to any of them. We avert eyes when we pass in the grocery store or at the gas station. Sometimes at night, in mid-October, when the air feels and smells like crisp leaves charring on a wood fire, I go to her grave. I stand beside the marker etched only with her name and the dates of her short, sad life. I never bring flowers, because I know if she were alive, she'd throw them back at me anyway. I don't talk because there's nothing to say. But I'd like to think that Tia's still out there somewhere, and that wherever she is, she knows. She knows a vigilante with a box of matches and a scarred heart roams the countryside, setting fire to carelessly cruel jocks and cheerleaders when they park in their gas-filled cars on country lanes, or ambushing them in dark parking lots. She knows about the house parties that end in flames, the moviegoers who choke on smoke as they blunder toward exit lights, the basketball games prematurely lost when the fire alarms shrill. She knows there hasn't been a hayride in this part of the state in 15 years. It's no kind of life, Tia Jefferson, this existence to which you've doomed me, doomed all of us, doomed our damned little town. But the little I can do, I do for you. And the October moon watches always, a pregnant harvest moon, red as blood, red as fire.